Get my suit and the rest of my clothes in first-class shape.
Hello, Mom.
Tell Art to get Bud's car
I don't know
fixed
why you
before-
worry about us so much. If anything happened to us, you'd hear
Dear
from the
Judy,
Navy
I
first
received
thing.
your letter about
I'm
2
safer
weeks
on this
ago.
battleship.
God, I sure wish that I could have been home to get a piece of that butterscotch pie you made. You'll have to make another.
December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet leaves thousands of Americans dead or dying. Any expectations that the American nation could remain at peace died with them that Sunday morning in a 2-hour attack that caught the U.S. command in Hawaii completely off guard. Surprise or not, Japan and the United States had been traveling down the road to Pearl Harbor for years. In the 1930s, when the two countries came into conflict over their role in the Far East. As an Asian power, Japan aimed for preeminence in the Orient. But Western powers with colonial and economic interests there foresaw the rise of Japanese power as a challenge to their collective domination of the region. England, the United States, France, and Holland watched uneasily as ultranationalists took political control of Japan and imposed a military government. A clash seemed almost inevitable. Trouble began first in China in 1931. Japanese military officers acting without authority from Tokyo seized Manchuria and installed a puppet government. To the United States, with long-standing interests in China and the Philippines, these events were cause for concern. Later, in 1937, the Japanese army provoked a war with China that turned into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in history. Japanese soldiers and pilots were becoming battle-hardened veterans in these campaigns. The warrior spirit, Bushido, bred discipline, sacrifice, and bravery. The Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. But the Japanese refused to be deterred. Japan had her sights on French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and British possessions nearby which produced vital raw materials they desperately needed.
Japan had very little in the way of oil resources herself and was dependent on oil imports. Oil runs everything. It runs industry, runs transportation, and most importantly, it ran the Army and the Navy. Any kind of a modern industrial society, any kind of a modern military establishment is just going to come to a grinding halt without oil.
Oil, more than anything else, was the linchpin of Japan's military might. No ship could move, no plane could fly, no tank could roll without it. And Japan, an island nation, depended almost entirely on the United States for its imported oil. With Japanese armies closer to U.S., British, and Dutch-controlled territories in the region, Imperial Japan cast a darkening shadow over colonial rule. When World War II broke out in Europe, the situation in the Far East went from bad to worse. Nazi aggression on the Western Front all but eclipsed Japan's movements in Asia. With Germany's defeat of France and the Netherlands, and with Britain under siege by Hitler's Luftwaffe, the unprotected European colonies in Asia seemed ripe for the picking. Seeing the potential to paralyze its competition, Japan sided with the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, in the European conflict. In 1940, the Tripartite Agreement was signed, and together the three nations marched confidently toward world domination. In 1941, Japan took French Indochina. With Japanese forces now within striking distance of the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, the temptation was too much to resist. President Franklin Roosevelt's administration, knowing that oil was Japan's Achilles heel, retaliated by embargoing the export of U.S. oil and raw materials to Japan. For the Japanese, the situation was desperate.
Japan, within a year, was facing economic ruin. She could either disengage in China and cease to desist her alliance with Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, refrain from that kind of provocation in China, and become more acceptable to the Allies. She chose the road to war.
In her thirst for expansion, the Japanese were certain to meet American opposition from the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet. But the push into Southeast Asia would require a massive commitment of Japanese naval power, leaving Japanese supply lines and even the home islands exposed. Existing plans called for the Japanese to lure the American fleet westward and finish it off in a final battle near the Japanese homeland. Japan and America were headed for war. The only questions were how and when. The Imperial Navy looked to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto for the answer. Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, was a brilliant and unorthodox officer at a time when the world viewed heavily armored battleships as the ultimate weapons of oceanic warfare. Yamamoto saw that the future belonged to the air. He encouraged the growth of Japanese naval aviation and was a driving force behind the creation of its carrier arm. When Japan's leaders made the decision for war against the United States, Yamamoto argued against it, but the die was cast.
Yamamoto was an Eastern man that appreciated Western ways. He had been partially educated at Harvard University, a naval attaché in Washington. He knew us as a people. He knew us economically, our industrial strength. He knew us as the moral fiber of this country. He believed a war with the United States could not be won, and often warned his friends in letters and in conversation that this should never take place.
And in that sense, he was, I think, different and more far-seeing and had a broader vision than other Japanese officers in either service, either the Army or the Navy. A lot of officers in both services saw the Americans as soft and unable to fight a prolonged war, just not having the stomach for it. Yamamoto knew different, though.
But he is also a loyal son of Japan, and once the decision to go to war with the United States was made, he did his duty. And his duty was trying to win the war as quickly as possible and hope the Americans would sue for peace. Occupied with what was going on with Europe, perhaps Japan would be left alone with its possessions it had quickly gained.
Yamamoto reasoned that a preemptive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor offered the best chance of Japanese success. With the American fleet neutralized, Imperial forces could sail south and easily seize control of the European possessions. His master plan relied on all 6 of Japan's heavy aircraft carriers and the cream of her naval aviators to carry out the surprise attack. It was a daring plan which drew heavy opposition from more conventionally minded admirals. Yamamoto prevailed, but only after threatening to resign. As a concession, He agreed to supplement his forces with 5 midget submarines, which were to sneak into the harbor undetected and join in the battle once it began. Since 1902, Hawaii has been America's strategic bastion in the mid-Pacific. In 1941, Fleet Commander Admiral Husband E. Kimmel worried about war with Japan, but was preparing his fleet for offensive operations on islands far to the west of Hawaii. Kimmel suspected that prowling Japanese submarines might inflict annoying damage around the islands, but gave little serious thought to the possibility of a fleet action or airstrike from such a great distance. This myopic attitude failed to see the fleet as the Japanese saw it, an inviting target rather than a deterrent. The fleet, though, was not the only target. U.S. planes had to be put out of action quickly, or the Japanese raiders could suffer heavy losses from American fighters. Even worse, U.S. bombers could exact vengeance on the Japanese carriers. Also marked for destruction were Hickam Field, home base for the Army's heavy bomber force. Wheeler Field, where Army's interceptors lay parked wingtip to wingtip. Kaneohe Naval Air Station with its long-range PBY patrol planes, and Bellows Field on Oahu's windward coast. Pearl Harbor's Ford Island, where the fleet's aircraft were repaired and maintained, and the nearby Marine Air Station at Ewa. To round out the Japanese plan, the sprawling Army base at Schofield Barracks was a designated target.
Hawaii itself was so heavily fortified with troops, airfields, and coastal artillery, not to mention the presence of the Pacific Fleet, that it was felt to be a Pacific Gibraltar, impregnable to any kind of attack, and the Japanese would be very, very foolish indeed to attack Hawaii.
The mindset of the Americans was on the offensive, that once the war started, the fleet would sail out and tangle with the Japanese and the Marshalls and the Kwajalein Atoll area, and they would develop this War Plan Orange. That's why a lot of resources were held back here at Pearl Harbor. For instance, patrol planes that were supposed to be going around and they perhaps spotting approaching ships 360 degrees were held back in reserve, because in the war plan they would be sent out to advanced bases and the scouting arc would stay there. If you have a mindset that you will be on the offensive, you're not thinking of someone coming in right literally in your own backyard and hitting you before you can even move.
Hawaii's Army garrison, commanded by Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, had one overriding mission: to protect the U.S. Navy fleet while in Hawaiian waters. With the winds of war in the air, Short made certain that his forces were on the defensive. They trained their weapons and attention not on the horizon, but instead on what they viewed as a more immediate danger: Hawaii's Japanese community. Originally imported to the islands as sugar plantation workers, Japanese immigrants and their descendants accounted for 40% of the territory's population. Many Americans before World War II refused to accept Asian Americans and doubted their loyalty, regardless of whether they were U.S. citizens. To a noticeable degree, the power of prejudice infected the officer corps of the Navy and Army. Tragically, it also influenced the way in which U.S. commanders in Hawaii prepared for war. In the mid-1930s, an obscure Army intelligence officer in Hawaii devised a plan to take hostages from among the leaders of Hawaii's Japanese-American community. If war were to break out, his plan targeted 128 prominent citizens by name, address, and occupation. The name of the obscure officer, George S. Patton, Jr., later to achieve fame in World War II as commander of the Third Army. Patton's plan was never implemented, but it spoke volumes about military fears of fifth-column activities in Hawaii.
The term fifth column actually originated in the Spanish Civil War, when one of the Spanish generals attacking a Spanish city, I believe it was Madrid, was asked what was the decisive factor in his victory. He said it was the fifth column, when in fact he only had 4 columns of troops, the fifth column being his sympathizers within the besieged city. And the term fifth column came to mean a large group of spies, saboteurs, and sympathizers within the enemy camp who, at the crucial moment in battle, would assist the attacking forces.
In Hawaii, these fears had dire consequences. Scarce resources were channeled into preparing for an imagined fifth column threat rather than any real danger from abroad. On November 27, 1941, planes on Army airfields were parked together in tight groups so they would be easier to guard from ground attack. But in the gun sights of an approaching enemy air force, clusters of American planes were like bullseyes for bombing and strafing runs. Meanwhile, the 6 carriers and escorting warships of Admiral Nagumo's First Air Fleet slipped unobserved from a remote bay in northern Japan. The Imperial fleet followed a stormy and infrequently used route across the northern Pacific to conceal their movements. Severe weather and the need to maintain radio silence made navigation difficult. In the mountainous swells, several sailors were washed overboard. Against the challenge of the seas, ships and crews endured. On Sunday, December 7th, the task force came within striking distance of the Hawaiian Islands. In the best samurai tradition, the ritual of battle unfolded. Hone your sword, strike quickly, administer the first blow. Beginning at 6 a.m., warrior after warrior lifted undetected into the morning sky north of Oahu. .353 attack planes sped in 2 waves toward the heart of American power in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. The marauders bore just enough fuel and ordnance to bomb and strafe predetermined targets. Fighters, torpedo planes, and dive bombers all clung possessively to their chief advantage, the element of surprise. For the advancing forces, the daybreak resembling their Imperial flag was a brilliant omen for success. But even as they winged their way southward, the first glimmering warnings were there for those Americans on Oahu who cared to look for them.
There's an old adage in military intelligence that the best information is useless if you don't believe it. Just before 7, two young privates, Lockhart and Elliott, at a mobile radar station on the north shore of Oahu, spotted a large blip heading in from the north toward Oahu. They didn't know what it was. They called the information center in Fort Shafter, as they were supposed to do, to report it. And they were told by the senior officer present, "Don't worry about it. They're probably our planes." Well, as it turned out, they weren't our planes. They were the Japanese heading toward Oahu and Pearl Harbor.
A flight of B-17s from the mainland was expected to arrive that morning. Because people tend to see the expected, the primitive radar images were not interpreted as a threat. Another warning went unheeded. In the early morning, Japanese midget submarines nearly tripped the alarm system while trying to navigate the narrow channel entrance to Pearl Harbor.
It's a very difficult task to do because you got to get in a harbor less than 300 yards wide and not be detected, and it's only 40 feet deep. But the attempt was made. Apparently one of these actually did get in the harbor. But on another submarine that was attempted to get in, the destroyer Ward was on routine patrol, and she had picked up a signal from the supply ship Antares that was pulling in that morning that something was following her. So the Ward immediately turned into action and swung towards the target and opens fire, depth charge the submarine. A PBY plane also gets into the action, which is a Navy patrol plane, and also drops bombs to assault the submarine. They sink the submarine. And then a message is sent in past 6:30 to SINCA's headquarters to notify them that I've fired a depth charge on a submarine operating within the defensive sea area. Well, like any bureaucracy, it takes a while to bump that up, and certainly that morning was no different. And it got up to Admiral Kimmel eventually, but it was well after 7 o'clock. And he was on his way down to headquarters to check out this incident when the attack begins.
While Admiral Kimmel awaited confirmation of the report, the first wave of the strike force was crossing Oahu's north shore. Surprise was complete, and for two great nations, it was the last moment of peace.
It was such a beautiful day. It's something you would never expect on a Sunday morning. So quiet, so peaceful. Bang, that's all I can say.
Today, Kaneohe is the site of a Marine Corps air station. On December 7th, 1941, the sprawling peninsula was home for a newly constructed naval air station, supporting long-range PBY scout planes. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fell on Kaneohe.
So far as I can see, we were the first to be hit that morning because they wanted to get our planes out of the way so that we could not follow them out at sea in order to reach their carrier task force. I was actually riding the bicycle between the hangars when they strafed me. All of them here at the station were the bravest men that I have ever seen in my life. I saw people taking machine guns out of the planes, single-handed, 50 caliber machine guns. The plane is burning, reaching up and taking those guns out, which is almost inhuman. Well, we lost practically every plane we had. Worst of the damage of planes where they're burnt. Completely collapsed on the ramp. The ones that were fired and had bullet holes in them, we were able to repair. The rest of them, we just took a bulldozer and shoved them off over on the corner and made a great big stack, and they sat there for months. It was a sneak attack, unprovoked, uncalled for. They were talking peace, and we were sending over our scrap metal for them to throw right back at us.
More bombs, tons more, were yet to be released on unsuspecting servicemen in and near Pearl Harbor. American soldiers and sailors had just begun the relaxed routine of a Sunday morning in paradise.
We were so naive sitting there, getting ready to go to church, play football, baseball, reading the Sunday paper, writing letters home.
It was not a surprise to see aircraft early on Sunday morning flying, quite a few of them flying around. When the carriers used to come in from sea duty, all of the aircraft used to take off and fly in, and they'd land the aircraft at Fort Island. And on the way in, they'd always buzz the place to let everybody, wake everybody up on Sunday mornings, let everybody know the Navy was here.
I think my life changed about 7:55 that morning when we were going to watch him drop the dummy torpedo on us. So he says, come on over, we'll watch it, and you're going to hear a thud.
We seen a torpedo plane come over with a big torpedo in its belly. And I told this guy who was with me, I said, geez, that's a Japanese plane. Look at the rising sun on it.
Well, we went over to the port side, and we saw the plane drop the torpedo. And he climbed up over the side of the ship there. He was about 15 feet off the water when he dropped the torpedo.
Someone aboard top side of the Maryland hollered that the Army was dropping sandbags, practicing. So, of course, we all ran on top side to observe this.
And then it couldn't have been more than a second or two later, that tremendous roar, and it blew Stanley and I on the other side of the ship towards the starboard side of the ship.
We thought they were marker bombs, and it was a drill. Very suddenly, one plane starts coming directly at us about 40 feet above the water. We see red lights flashing from his wings, and we joke and laugh. We'd say, must be a new type of camera that they record drills in. Those are machine guns firing at us, and the bullets are ricocheting off the bulkhead over around us. One of the bullets finally struck the cook in the mouth, and down he dropped.
We were still being strafed. It was just that, but you just kind of moved around the ship and hoped the hell you didn't get hit.
But there was no doubt in my mind about it, because as soon as I saw that first plane and heard the explosions, I knew what it was. And that was the start of a bad day.
From their vantage point above Battleship Row, Japanese pilots were in complete control of the assault, but the attacking forces were not alone. 2 Americans were sharing this incredible perspective of history in the making.
My father was a sportsman pilot, and we frequently would fly on Sunday mornings, just for the fun of it. And Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941 was no exception. And just as we were passing the Honolulu International Airport, which is next to Pearl Harbor, the attack started. So we got a grandstand view of the whole thing. Then we saw debris flying up in the air at Hickam Air Force Base, and I saw planes down on the ground flying very, very low. And I said to my dad, I said, hey, look, there are P-40s taking off. and there's something happening to the hangars, and he said, P-40s hell, they're Japs. We saw the fires and the low-level strafing and the skip bombing. We could see that from the air. We could see the fires in Pearl Harbor and the ships burning and the confusion, anti-aircraft fire from the ships. So we were up above the action, and we felt safer there, and that's why we stayed up almost a half an hour, circling around and around. Well, I think they probably saw us for what we were. It was just a small private airplane that was caught up in the air in the attack, and we were no threat to them. And actually, the people that were worried about us were the Army on the ground. They thought that we were directing the attack, and so they tried to shoot us down, but fortunately they missed. We're here.
The primary targets of Yamamoto's airmen were the aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet. But since no carriers were in the harbor that morning, they trained their sights to the battleships. Sting at Battleship Row that morning, the USS Nevada, Arizona, West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, Oklahoma, and California. Despite the impressive firepower concentrated in the harbor, American forces found themselves nearly defenseless. The normally tranquil harbor awoke to a nightmare of devastation. Desperate men sprayed any ordnance they could find into the air, and much of it returned to Earth only to find their own ships or civilian areas of Honolulu. The larger battleship guns were of little use against aerial targets. A few planes were shot down, but confusion reigned.
And about this time, there was a periscope with one of these little two-man submarines. So I had the trainer train the gun around. We just set 0-0, and then I told him, I said, load in a slug. And one of the loaders back there says, we ain't got no bullets.
The ammunition box had a padlock on it, so we couldn't even open it. So we just stood there and watched them lay 7 torpedoes into the West Virginia and Oklahoma.
Everybody was doing something, either running here, running there, firing a submachine gun fruitlessly at the attacking planes. I don't suppose any of them ever hit anything with a Tommy gun, but they tried.
A group of people hammered the locks off the ammunition lockers, loaded the gun, and fired the gun. They were firing star shells. A star shell is the type of shell that is used at night for illumination purposes. So what we were doing while the gun could fire was astounding the Japanese pilots by putting on a show like the 4th of July of explosions in the sky and doing no damage whatsoever.
The planes came in and were cross-eyed stern, which we could see very easily. Their outline of the men, their heads, eyeballs, this close.
They were looking out of the side of the airplane, grinning as they flew overhead at a very low altitude. You could see those teeth and count them.
He was so close that had I had a rock, I could perhaps hit him with it. You could hit him with an apple.
If I'd had an orange, I could have hit the doggone planes when they come over.
I could see the smile on his face, and as I always said, come from the state of Idaho, if I had a spud, I could hit him right between the eyes with it. And I think today I could still identify the guy.
He was getting away with murder because nobody was firing back.
U.S. battleships were considered unsinkable. They bore protective armor designed to withstand torpedo penetration. But the Japanese modified fish hit many of the outboard ships below these belts. These torpedoes inflicted mortal wounds, allowing highly flammable fuel oil to bleed into the harbor.
This concludes part 1 of The Truth Behind Pearl Harbor. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification icon to get notified when part 2 is released in the near future. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and catch you in the next one. Ciao for now. Please join me for a few moments of silence for the men who lost their lives on that fateful day. May God bless them, and may they rest in eternal peace.